So, Paul, I know that you did some media pieces over the weekend, and a couple of them I would say were maybe hit pieces that they were kind of trying to cast our industry in a bit of a negative light, even though it was the Academy Award weekend. And it's interesting to me that people point to, because not quite understanding where we are and how we got here. Meaning, you and I have been talking about for the last year about how lack of product has definitely contributed to the downturn in box office. And granted, we got to go look back, as you and I did when we were at Show East, and we looked at the beginning of 2022, and the Omicron variant was very prevalent at that point. Studios were pushing releases back. Things didn't really get cooking until, May of last year? I know we had the Batman in March, but outside of that, really, it was kind of touch and go until we got a steady flow of product that really started with Top Gun, right? Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and that sort of kicked off a ton of movie going over that summer movie season. And although, of course, the release calendar was thrown into disarray by production delays and all that, and we talked about this ad nauseum last year, that we didn't have a consistent pattern of releases, and we were down 41 wide releases. And I pointed out this particular outlet that if you build it, they will come. And I'm just going to always use that, Mike, because even though it's a cliche, it's really true when it comes to the movie theater. But I will say, they put in this outlet, they were great. They put in what I had said about this is an industry that's had to adjust, obviously, for the past couple of years. And that with 30 more wide release films in 2023, that this is going to be a great year. So while this outlet was leaning in a very negative direction about our industry, I was really pleased to see that they included my comments. They were fair. I didn't love the headline, but headlines, Mike, that's the thing that grabs people.
Right. I do want to address one other thing, though, that came from what we were talking about, and that is the perception that theatrical is a dying industry. And I've heard that comment numerous times. And I take exception to it. And beyond that, I would actually argue against it when you sit and look at what has transpired over the last year. And we've discussed many times as well, and that is the one good thing industry-wise that came out of the pandemic was all of the different windows that we tried. Every kind of distribution pattern or idea was attempted, analyzed, and where did we settle back on? We settled back on, wow, we need a theatrical window. We need something that is exclusive to theatrical because that elevates the level of the property. I literally just having lunch with a studio exec today, we were talking about the very thing, and he was saying, doesn't matter the level of the release, it needs a theatrical. The theatrical helps elevate it, and when you go into whatever that next window is, and you go to PVOD and somebody has to spend $20 for it, it's like, oh yeah, I meant to see that in the movie theater. So there is a halo effect, there is a cascading effect, and what we've all come back to is theatrical is very important to the live stream of these films. And to say it's a dying industry is a generalization, and I don't think you're doing your homework if you say something like that.
And a lot of times it comes from those who aren't in the industry, who either have heard things or talked to their friends or read things that have a very negative connotation and negative view of our industry. And the National Cinema Foundation just had their great report that came out. It's 100% correct that having a movie in theaters first adds value, like you just said, the halo effect to movies. They have more value and they become more coveted, wanted, and desired, to not use every adjective in the world, but for people to see them once they land on streaming. Oh, that movie was in a theater. That must mean it's a really good movie, or at least had the gravitas behind it, either financially or creatively, to go for that theatrical run. As we know, Mike, theatrical run takes a bit more heavy lifting in terms of marketing spend. If you're going out on a global release, that's not an inexpensive endeavor. I think studios have become more selective, which is a good thing, on which movies they're going to put in theater, which movies go to streaming. Just bombarding theaters with terrible movies is not going to help theaters.
No.
It's just better to have great movies that are more curated, at least on the green light stage, and then at the point where studios decide, is this going to go on a platform? And, some of the studios don't have a major platform presence. Many of them do. And a lot of them are just totally devoted to theatrical. And you know what? It's not altruistic. it makes financial sense to go theatrical first. Have a window. You could debate the length of the windows all day long, but a window of some sort is always the best path for studios to take. Again, for movies intended for, created, made to land on that big screen first. And then that helps streaming down the road to have these movies available.
I think you're starting to see that too, with the different platforms are realizing that. You look at what Amazon is doing coming up with Air, a movie that was originally scheduled to go direct to Prime Video. They're now taking a big swing theatrically. They're giving it a real shot. I hear the movie's fantastic. Everybody I've talked to has said, I've seen the movie already. I want to see it again. And I think what you're going to see coming out of this is Amazon realizes that Prime becomes more valuable when that becomes that want to see. That thing that exploded in theaters is something that's a cultural phenomenon that I can see on my platform. And theaters, there's no argument that they've struggled over the last 2.5 years. We've all seen it, but the entire economy has struggled over the last 2.5 years.
But Mike, don't you feel like sometimes people are rooting for movie theaters to fail? Is that just because it's a big story? Because it's like a takedown of a legendary industry that's been around forever, that's taken on every challenge and has come back a winner? I don't get it. And it's okay, because there's always going to be different perceptions of what's going on in the industry. And just real quick, though, the movie Air is from MGM. So with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, directed by Ben Affleck. It's about the partnership between then rookie Michael Jordan and Nike's fledgling basketball division. This looks like a winner to me, Mike. And like you said, for Amazon, I think Creed 3 is the best thing that ever happened to Air, because it kind of sets that up for great success. And it's also great for the Amazon executives to learn from the experience with Creed, that going theatrical first, just it elevates everything, and it makes Amazon look cool too.
And, you know, you and I were talking about this earlier, and I think it's important to know when you look back at what has transpired in 2023 alone, we've had the biggest opening ever for a film in the Rocky universe with Creed 3, which is now over $100 million after a great hold last weekend. We've had the biggest opening ever in the Scream franchise at $44 million. Blows away all the pre-release estimates. It seems like every weekend you and I are saying, well, that movie exceeded the pre-release estimates.
And John Wick 4 is on a great trajectory. I mean, I've heard...
John Wick 4 is going to be... I've talked to a few exhibitors and, you know, I've said, what do you think? How's it going to do? And their eyes get big. And it's like, I hope they have enough popcorn in the building to be able to handle all the business that's coming from that one. But even coming up to John Wick 4, you look at where we are. I mean, look at something like Lionsgate's other movie that they've had, The Jesus Revolution, which is pushing $40 million right now. Here's a movie that I guarantee you on our listeners' radar, very few of that until we talked to Brandon Gregory a few weeks ago even knew that movie was coming.
Right.
And here's a movie that's probably going to top out over $50 million, which is very additive to the business. So I guess the long story short here is, you know, the theatrical business is alive. As we've been saying from day one, it's evolving. It's constantly evolving. It's not something that is set in stone the way it is. I think it was great from a standpoint of we finally worked through all these window issues. I don't feel like those exist anymore. That was a yin and a yang that was on everybody's mind for several years. I think now everybody is very realistic about what a window is, what it does, whether it's a PVOD, how that affects it, how streaming affects it. I think we've all seen that PVOD has a minimal effect on the box office, but streaming has a very adverse effect on the box office. But these are all things that we've learned over the course of the last couple of years of being able to kind of work in the petri dish because of the unfortunate area that the business had fallen into. It allowed for all of these different kind of test patterns, if you want to call it that. And now here we are where we all come out of it and everybody's kind of in agreement of where this thing is headed.
And I think, you know, we're going to reevaluate over at Comscore what this year could do in terms of box office. We're always very conservative on trying to predict, at least in March, what the full year will generate in terms of domestic revenue and certainly global revenue as well. You know, I was interviewed for an article in the Financial Times last week, and I had said, you know, I think we need to as they say, Mike, in our industry, manage expectations. And I was like, yeah, I think we certainly get to over 9 billion. Somebody else in the article, a studio executive, had said, oh, I think that's way conservative. I think we get back to almost where we were in 2019. That's neither here nor there. I'm rooting for the latter. I definitely want it to be at over 11 billion. I think it's not even about that number. It's just about what is the feeling in this marketplace. What has happened with Creed 3, Megan, Man Called Otto, all these movies? They've been doing really well. And March is going to feel like May. We talked about this last week on the podcast. I feel like, and Mike, it makes sense, and you could disagree with me, that we fixate on these numbers like 9 billion, 10 billion, 11 billion. What really matters is where we were 2 years ago and where we are now. It's incredible, this comeback story for the industry.
That's a great point. So rewind back to, this happens to be the weekend that everything shut down. As Don McLean would say, this was the weekend the music died, back in 2020.
You're right, Mike. March 2020, for those of you, it's ingrained in my brain that that's the day movie theaters essentially shut down.
And so when you look at 3 years ago and where everybody thought this industry was headed and where everybody thought everything else was headed, to come back and say we did $7.5 billion in 2022. Right now, probably looks like, $9 billion in 2023 on the conservative side with a shot at 10?
If we don't get, like we talked about all year last year about the 41 fewer films could have represented $2 billion in domestic box. If we have 30 more films this year and each one of those did 20 to 40 million, that's a bit of a, I'm using broad strokes here. But if we were at 7.5, look at the movies on the way and also the more consistent pattern of those movies being released.
I did this last week. I looked at the release schedule, was looking at some release dates. From March 31st through the end of April, do you know how many wide releases, or at least, I guess wide, 1,500 or more? I'm changing my own number because I always say 2,000, but let's use... Actually,
yeah, I do
you know
too.
what? No, I'm going to say wide because they're all wide at this point. You know how many wide releases we have on the calendar between end of March and end of April?
So that 1 month period.
17.
That
17.
Release. Wow.
So having content's not going to be an issue.
Mike, that's too many. That's too many.
It's feast or famine. You're right.
Yeah. But that's, look, we'll take it because having too few doesn't work. That never works. But I feel like that there's a momentum happening right now. And the Academy Awards, we'll touch on that a little bit. But the Academy Awards last night, I think, was really fun to watch. I think it's kind of back to where it used to be. People will always argue, Mike, about the Academy Awards, whether they worked or they didn't. Jimmy Kimmel had some good singers in there. There was no slap this year. It was very interesting. We could actually do a bonus episode on Oscars, but the point is I think people are really psyched about going to movie theaters again. And I think there was much more attention on the Oscars this year for a variety of reasons. But I think this is a business that's poised and already is in the midst of one of the greatest comebacks ever. And this weekend, it kind of shocked me to have the question asked, is this industry dying?
Let's talk about this weekend for a second. And then, then we can talk about the Academy Awards. So we are looking at, I don't know, what was it? Almost $118 million of box office.
It was $118 million in box office. The year to date through Sunday the 12th is up 30% versus last year at this point. And Mike, as we both pointed out on this podcast 2 weeks ago or so, was that we hit $1 billion in box office this year on Friday, Feb 24. And last year, we didn't hit it till a couple days ago on the 11th. So we're going at a much more impressive clip in terms of the box office rate. But yeah, great weekend this weekend. And let's give credit, Mike, to 65.
I was about to say,
as well.
Let's just run down these for a second, just so we can talk about how the business is dying.
Yeah.
So Scream 6 comes out, $44.45 million, the biggest opening ever for the Scream franchise. So clearly Scream is in trouble.
Yeah.
Creed 3, down 53% from the first week, $27.25 million, $101.44 million total gross. Yes, we can put the death knell in Creed. Obviously, that's not doing very well.
I think it's over
for that one. 65, which you just brought up, top end was in the estimates was maybe it would do 10. ended up doing
It did 12.3,
12.3 million.
according to our Comscore data.
So there's another one. Everyone's going to point to Ant-Man and the Wasp, and they're going to say, oh, look how disappointing that is. Did 7.13. It's up to 198 million.
Almost 200 million domestically.
Correct. And here's a movie that, let's be frank, didn't score great with audiences, got a B cinema score. Disney did a fantastic job opening the movie, and it's going to do, at the end of the day, 2.25. Again, okay, that's a decent gross, I would think. Cocaine Bear in week 3, another 6.25 million, goes over the $50 million mark, $51.7 million.
And let's not forget Paul Brooks's
Champion,
starring Woody Harrelson, directed by Bobby Farrelly.
got an A cinema score.
Yep.
And did $5.15 million for the weekend. And then, as I mentioned before, you've got Jesus Revolution with another 5.13 at $39.4 million.
Mike, on our podcast, Ticket to Ride, we have interviewed 2 of the main people associated with 2 movies in the top 10.
That is true. And we should probably just, as a toss away, Avatar Way of Water is closing in $674 million. To take the tact, I guess, that movie theaters are dead. People don't want to go to the movies. It's a sensationalistic way of reporting right now. And I know we're going to have our good friend Sarah Whitten on in a couple of weeks.
Oh, yes. She will be on here.
And for those that don't know, Sarah writes for CNBC and is a really smart person in this field, really, really informed. I want to hear her take on some of that as well, because...
Yeah, I do too. She makes us smarter, Mike. When we appeared with her on the panel at Show East last year, just the whole thing got better because you and I, we get into it. Once we start talking, we can't stop. She comes in, she's the voice of reason and adds a lot to what we're talking about. So we're going to have the great Sarah Whitten on our show in the future.
We're talking this with people all week long. Am I looking at it through rose-colored glasses? I don't think so. I think I'm being as honest as is, but would like to hear what Sarah has to say on this.
Sarah will keep us honest, but I think the thing is, Mike, if every movie we just talked about opened with $5 million or something and nobody was going to the theaters, I would say, you know what? I love this industry, but I can't defend it. I can't. But it just hasn't happened that way. If you can give me empirical, real evidence, and yes, you and I are both nobody's going to be shocked by this. We're very pro big screen. We're very pro movie theater studios putting out movies in theaters. We love streaming as well, but there should be a window for those films that are intended for the big screen. But the evidence, just even if you took our spin out of it, Mike, I don't know how you could say that theaters are dying when you look at this. Now, some theaters closing is different than theaters are dying.
By the way, that's a really good point you make there, Paul. Over the course of my career, there have been ebbs and flows in the screen count that's out there. There was a point we got near 40,000 screens, and then there were all the bankruptcies that happened with all the theaters from the overbuilding when they all went to megaplexes. That got cleaned up. Now we're kind of going through it again, and I don't have to rehash, what circuits may or may not be in trouble, but you can read that in the business pages. And again, that's the business pages. More to do with management of the circuits, management of how the money is allocated as opposed to the business itself. Now, granted, it's been challenging over the last couple of years. I don't think anyone's going to argue that. And that definitely puts a lot of stress on a lot of these different operators. But, some of the operators have taken full advantage of it. I think one is, and I think you had him on your other podcast, was Brock Bagby over at B&B. To use a poker analogy, Brock went all in. Brock saw this as an opportunity. And when there were locations that became available, Brock went and picked them up. And B&B has then expanded to become one of the top 5 exhibitors in the country.
Yeah, they've been listed this week as one of the top exhibitors. Brock Bagby, Bob Bagby, the entire Bagby family, so vested in that. And that's a great story of never giving up. And I'm sure, and I talked about this with Brock on the Many Screens Big Picture podcast last year, that there had to be some dark days there where they're like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? And that was true for everyone. But I think for me, just kind of wrap this with a bow, is that this weekend we had the Oscars. I think we saved that for another podcast episode, maybe a bonus. But this was a weekend that was a solid weekend in theaters. I think we have great movies coming up. I just don't know how you could still say that movie theaters are dying or that the movie-going experience is going extinct, because it's just not.
I want to touch on the Oscars real quick. I thought it was a great tale of two cities, so to speak. So it was great that we had the big movies that were nominated, such as Avatar, obviously Top Gun Maverick, but it was just so kind of fun to see an indie distributor, old school A24, killing it with Everything Everywhere All at Once. A really interesting and unique movie, which, by the way, over $75 million of box office. So you've got both the big giant tentpoles that between Avatar and between Top Gun, you're looking at 1.3 billion of domestic box or whatever that happens to be, or 1.4. And then on the other hand, you've got the little movie that could with A24 doing Everything Everywhere All at Once. And Paul, isn't that kind of the history of the movie business?
That is. It's right there. It's a microcosm of the business. You know, with those films generating, all of them collectively, close to 1.7 billion in just domestic box office, with Elvis being, 100 million plus hit. And then you mentioned Top Gun, Maverick, and Avatar: The Way of Water. I thought this was the perfect lineup of Best Picture nominees. You could argue back and forth about whether or not your favorite was in there, whoever. And I love that Brendan Fraser won, and kudos to Austin Butler for having an incredible award season. It was a fun show. This, to me, represents what the Oscars are going to look like in the modern era, whether you like the show or not or whatever. I think they did a really good job of just kind of, after a couple, 3 years of it not really being sidelined, not being the same, certainly in 21 and 22, I thought this was a real return to form, and it's a work in progress. And, we're going to find out more. We'll see what happens next year. But this was, I thought, a really great Oscars. It was really fun to watch. The fact that Everything Everywhere, A24, really did a great job with that. But also every other studio, I think, pretty much was represented. And then a lot of great wins for the animated category, documentary film, cinematography, and all the rest. But it was a fun one to watch. And the musical numbers were great. And I think the industry is not dead, Mike.
I'm willing to bet on that. And I keep saying this, and I think I've said this to you over and over again. Will it be what it was prior to the pandemic? Probably not. Is it what it was prior to Betamax? Is it what it was prior to TV? Is it what it was prior to radio? Is it what it was prior to talkies? No.
How about prior to, writing on the cave wall?
I mean, my point being, and that goes back to what you were saying earlier, is the death sentence to the motion picture business has been written several times over the course of time and hasn't been able to knock it out yet.
And I really like what you said there, Mike, about, is it different when Betamax, when the beta tapes came out, and then VHS, TV and all that. It is really one of the most resilient businesses ever. And, you look at the pay telephone. I always say the movie theaters are not the pay telephone. There is something singular, and I know we could just gush on Mike because we just love the movie theater experience so much. But it was just a great weekend to kind of point out not only that the box office was strong, but that people were really interested in the Oscars. And again, I really do appreciate the outlets who, at least, they may play devil's advocate, but they certainly were cool getting the message out that may not have aligned with what they originally thought. So I have to give kudos to many of the outlets who are willing to look at the evidence and say, oh, well, maybe that's not what happened. I mean, headlines notwithstanding, but that's a whole different thing. But it really is kind of cool to see that. It's good that we're actually having this conversation, Mike.
It is.
I mean the royal we, the world.
No, the royal we. Look, it's something that needs to be discussed. It's something that everyone 3 years ago, as we were talking about, you would have been like, we're done. There's no way we're going to ever be able to, come back from this. And everybody's watching them at home, and they're going to get used to watching it at home, and they're not going to want to go back to the movie theater. And I think we've all kind of seen that that's not exactly the case.
That's right.
The going habits have changed. There's no doubt about it. I know our friends on the independent side are still struggling quite a bit. That being said, it doesn't mean that we're giving up yet. And I think that, looking ahead, the year looks great as far as the lineup of movies. Let's talk again in October and hope we're all still on the same warm and fuzzy.
We'll be here, Mike, on Ticket to Ride. I'm Paul DeGarabedian, Senior Media Analyst for Comscore, and Mike Polydorus, President of Paper Airplane Media. And we're always here every week on Ticket to Ride, our great podcast. Comscore is such a great bastion of data and numbers, and Mike and I love to be on the Comscore Ticket to Ride podcast. It's fantastic.
All right, Paul. Well, you have a wonderful week. By the way, we got another big opening this week. We got Shazam, Fury of the Gods.
Oh, yeah, Shazam, Fury of the Gods. But I'm telling you, man, John Wick can't get here fast.
He's on his way, and he's bringing the dog. So there you go.
He's bringing the heat. All right, Mike. Thanks a lot, man. Have a good one. See you next week.